We've got Aaron Evans, who has joined me on the screen over there. Aaron, I got to tell you, it looks like you have got the most awesome room I've ever seen. It looks like a circus tent to me over here. What is that you've got out there? Can you describe that room that you're in?
Yeah, am I live?
You are live. I've got you up on screen. We've got both of you, both of us
All right.
on screen there.
So I am in a yurt.
A yurt.
Which is like a big circus tent. It's a big round tent with a wood frame, as you can see, and a lattice work wall. This is my office. And yeah, it's hot in the summer and it's cold in the winter, but I manage.
Where are you located at, Aaron?
I am in Montana, so I've got a yurt in the woods for my office. Awesome. And Starlink internet.
Awesome. I've heard your name. I believe I've seen you present. You actually are very well known in the industry out there. I believe you have got a lot of experience.
Slightly infamous.
Slightly infamous, working in Selenium, Appium, REST API stuff, and well versed in all things related to automation and quality assurance. And I'm not even making that up. I just happened to ask Pi AI a little bit about you, and how wonderful that AI is. Well, getting kind of accurate on this. Sometimes it just makes up stuff. So
yeah, it was probably making up my story.
Nah, I know you're good. You're good at all this stuff. We're going to have a fantastic session. I'm going to ask you just to do a quick check. Can you share your first slide on the screen? See if it can pop up.
All right. Oh, it says I've got to give it permission, it looks like.
Yep, I've seen that before. While he's doing that, for all of us who are watching on the screen over here, there are, if I remember correctly, two ways that you can ask questions. One is if you're in this Apple Tech live meeting, you can ask questions out here. We'll see them pop up, and we will go and have interactions with, let's see, we'll have interactions with people as they ask questions here. And in addition, if you're watching it, I believe we're also live streaming on YouTube, if I can remember correctly. And you can also ask questions out there as well. So, hey, there's Aaron is back. We're going to do a quick test. Are you able to share on your slides and stuff?
Yeah, let me try that. So I'm going to click on a screen. Okay. It's probably going to say screen one. It's going to be blank at first. And then I need to hit play. And are you seeing the correct window or the presenter view?
Test frameworks, my favorite thing to play with. All right. Well, I tell you that with that, I'm going to turn it over to Aaron over here and blow us away. I'm really looking forward to this. Thanks a lot, Aaron.
All right, thank you. So yeah, I've talked a little bit about myself already. Thanks, Paul. I've been testing software for around 20 years, more or less, with a break in the middle where it wasn't a nervous breakdown, but it was a bit of a breakdown where I decided I'd give it all up, and I moved to Fiji to go live on a tropical island and forget about work for a while. But I came back, and it was really my getting into open source, of love of open source tools, and discovering Selenium around 2005 when it was first getting started, that got me back in and passionate for test automation and open source development. So that's kind of my backstory. And in the checkout room beforehand, Paul was asking me what my favorite test automation tool was, or my favorite tool, I guess, in general was. And I didn't have a good answer because I'm kind of tool agnostic. But my answer was, I think having a continuous integration tool is my favorite thing, and we'll talk about that. Why I think having a constant feedback loop is important, kind of the critical thing in terms of having a test framework. And when I talk about test frameworks, right, it's a little bit of an overloaded question. In that, what is a test framework and what does it do? Because the word framework itself is kind of overloaded, right? And I don't know if my I'm clicking on PowerPoint instead of on the presentation. All right, so what's a framework? It's an overloaded term, right? I looked up the word framework. This is the trick for amateur talk writer is, use the dictionary definition. I'm not going to read that, but here's two different dictionary definitions, and then the Wikipedia definition for a framework. We all know what a framework is, right? It's this superstructure that you build around your tools, and you can think about how a test framework is what you use to write tests. And in development, especially in front-end development, you can think in terms of a framework versus a library. And people say, well, AngularJS, for example, is a development framework because the framework executes the code and your code runs within that framework. Whereas React, they say, is a library because your code includes React and your code is actually what's executing. So that's one way to distinguish a framework. And it's a good principle, but the framework is really, or I guess React is a library instead of a framework. This is actually kind of an overloaded question because a lot of different things are frameworks. And when you say framework, what do you mean? And I'd just like to give a shout out to my boss at Massachusetts Medical Society, Stephanie Wojciechowski. We kind of banned the word framework on the project I'm currently working on because what is a framework? For the purposes of this talk, my definition is a framework is the tools, processes, architecture, and patterns that you use to write, maintain, execute, and analyze your test automation. So this is my working definition for what we're doing in terms of a framework, which is overloaded, as I said. And there are a lot of different kinds of frameworks, right? You might think of a framework, when I say a test framework, you might think of something like JUnit or Mocha or TestNG or one of these many other tools that is, in my definition, to be more specific, is a test runner. It's a way to write a test case using automation and to run it. So JUnit, yeah, it's a framework, or it's a part of your framework, right? It's the part that helps you to author and execute tests, but it's not the whole picture. You might also think, well, maybe Selenium or Cypress or Playwright or Appium or some other automation tool or library that's my test framework or part of my test framework. And that's true, but not all tests are UI automation. So we might also have API tests or unit tests or performance and load tests, security tests that may be part of our test automation framework. I'm kind of wigging out because I can't see a clock here. I'll get my phone. Oh, there we go. I want to make sure I don't talk too long because I tend to talk about too many things. You may consider a tool used for structuring your test code or writing test specifications, specifically a behavior driven. Let me take a drink. A behavior driven development tool like Cucumber or SpecFlow for our C#.NET friends, or Spock or JBehave, or a tool that's a little bit different like Robot Framework that allows you to do keyword driven development and structure your tests that way, right? That's one way of looking at a test framework or one piece of the test framework puzzle. I think if we hop back at the beginning, that's kind of my theme, right? I'm gonna, oops, I lost my focus here. Yeah, putting the pieces together, and you can see I've got this cool puzzle of an architecture diagram as my background. All right, let's hop back ahead. So that's kind of the theme I'm going for here, right? Some other frameworks might be there are some like all-in-one tools. I grew up using a tool called WinRunner or Silk Test or Quick Test Pro. You can see which is now called UFT. Some commercial tools or some tools that have open source versions like Catalan. Um, uh, Test Complete and Tricentis Tosca are other tools that are kind of this all-in-one tool based around a GUI for writing test automation. That could be considered a framework or a piece of that framework puzzle, as well as um, other tools like reporting, your continuous integration flow. These are extra pieces of your test automation puzzle. But you've got things that have framework in the name, like Allure Framework. It started out as a reporting tool. It's grown to combine other features. Same thing with extent reports. And you might have a service like Report Portal that gives you reporting services. That could be a piece of the puzzle, or it could be considered a framework in itself. Your CI/CD tool or service, things like Jenkins, GitHub Actions, GitLab CI, Circle CI, Azure DevOps, which used to be called, help me out, was it just Microsoft Test Manager? I don't remember. Well, I think Microsoft Test Manager was part of what became Azure DevOps. I'm not a Microsoft guy, so I don't know that much about their tools. Those could be considered from a QA perspective, a framework or a piece of your framework that you're using. Likewise, we have our cloud services that are used to execute your tests, and they may also have nice tools for debugging and reporting. Services like Sauce Labs, Browser Stack, Lambda Test, Applitools, Perfecto, Headspin. There's quite a few more. None of these are meant to be an exhaustive or a favorites list. Just a list of a few things that I came up with. So these cloud services may be considered a test framework or a piece of your test framework puzzle. Likewise, we have frameworks, under code structure. Things like Serenity Framework, Selenide, Karate, which I think also might have a UI component and it might have a cloud service. I'm not too familiar with Karate, but there are tools that are designed to help you structure your code. Robot Framework could also fall under this category. That are frameworks in the framework sense, that they're a system of structuring your code, a bunch of helper and utility classes, including things like configuration, setting up Selenium or Cucumber or whatever other dependencies. Those can be considered frameworks, or they could be a part of this framework puzzle. Hopping back to my, if you remember, my all-encompassing weasel around definition, the tools, the processes, the architecture, and patterns that are used to write, maintain, execute, and analyze our test automation. Let's see. And then we have other things like load and performance, security, test management tools, like harking back to my old days, HP, or it was called Mercury, Quality Center, which is called ALM now, TestRail, Zephyr, X-Ray, Qmetry, TestLink is an old open source tool that's still kicking around that some people may be using, that are used for structuring tests, whether they're automated or manual, and for tracking requirements. So these are things that you may, right, when you're asked about your test framework, you might say, well, Selenium is my test framework, or my GitHub workflow is my test framework, or I'm using Allure framework or Selenide framework, right, or Cucumber, right? These might be my framework. JUnit might be my framework. It's a loaded question. All of these, I think, play a part in developing that framework, like I said, with that wiggle definition that accomplishes what we do, or that describes what we do to accomplish test automation. right? And these are just some bullets I'll quickly go through. Here's a big list of test runners, automation tools, and libraries. Now, some of these tools, like for instance, Selenium is just a library, whereas Cypress is, getting back to that early definition, a framework in that Cypress runs your test for you. You structure your code for Cypress to run the test. Selenium, you're going to structure your tests however you like, because it's just a library you include. You may use PyTest or NUnit or TestNG to execute your Selenium test. So you might have Selenium plus TestNG versus just Cypress, which one's test, or just WebDriver IO, which executes test, or Playwright, whatever. So there's a fine line I like to distinguish between a automation tool that also executes your test, leaning more towards framework, and an automation library like Selenium or Appium, or even if you're thinking like Android, Espresso, versus XCUI test on Apple side for iOS. That's kind of in between the framework and library, because XCUI test also has ability to integrate with XC test, which is their unit testing framework. Now, writing a test specification. This is an important part, and many organizations, a tool like Cucumber or SpecFo might be at the core of writing their tests, because one important thing of writing tests is knowing what you're testing, describing the requirements, describing the features and scenarios that you're testing. And these tools, Cucumber, SpecFlow. Robot Framework is not necessarily designed to create a specification, certainly not in the behavior-driven development sense, but it is a way to write automation code in reusable components that that you can then write keyword-driven tests. The goal here with these type of tools is to make tests that describe what's being happening from a user perspective, so you can understand, or so rather, non-technical people can understand without reading through the source code what's happening in the test and tie it to what's actually working. Here's the commercial automation tools, right? We've got Tricentis, Tosca, Test Complete by SmartBear, Ranarix, Catalan Studio, and then the old-fashioned QTP UFT, which is now owned by Micro Focus. And some organizations are paying large amounts of money per seat to run test automation, which may be new or maybe 10 or 20 years old to still run that tool, which was great in its time, but it's not the style of writing tests with open source. And it was actually by using commercial tools like QTP specifically, where I decided this is not what I like about testing, and decided I prefer palm trees and coconuts and snorkeling to writing test automation, and switching to a tool like Selenium and using open source tools, writing in programming languages I like Java or Python, made testing fun again for me. Tools like Serenity, Selenium, Codeception on the PHP. I think there's Codeception JS, which allows you to integrate and write Cucumber style tests with Selenium style automation. And then Karate, which has both GUI and I think really started out as an API automation tool. Again, this is just listing the tools. Nothing specific I need to talk about here. But API testing, right? There are tools or frameworks designed specifically for API testing. How do you fit these in with your GUI tests? Do they live in a different test framework? Do they work together or separate than your UI automation? A tool like Postman is great. It has a nice UI. It has ways to have collections and ways to execute tests automatically. You have tools like Newman. For those who don't know, Postman is a graphical tool for writing API tests, and Newman is a tool for writing continuous, or for executing those tests in continuous integration. And for people who are old enough or savvy enough, Newman was the postman who was the nemesis of Seinfeld on his sitcom back in the early 90s. So that's a fun play on words. Tools like SOAP UI, which was designed for testing SOAP web services, but actually also has a pretty cool amount of features for testing more modern or simpler services like REST services. And then Rest Assured and a host of HTTP client libraries, Supertest on the JavaScript side, allow you to write API automation. And it's a framework or a library, if you will. You can use Rest Assured either way as a framework or a library for executing tests, test automation. In my own preference, I like to use a unit test runner, something like JUnit, TestNG, PyTest, or XTest on the .NET side, or XUnit, I should say, on the .NET side, and build all of my automation, whether it's API automation or UI automation, or even unit tests or integration tests, whatever level, to write those using the same unit testing tool, and then incorporate my UI automation, my API automation, etc., using libraries like Selenium and Rest Assured. Then we have load and performance testing, right? Two different things. Again, there's semantics to worry about here. Let me check my clock. All right, I'm not going too far over on time. That makes me happy. Right, we have load testing tools like JMeter or Load Runner, another tool from back in the day that gave me a lot of headaches, that are designed to put a load on the system and measure that load. They are a framework unto themselves, and often don't incorporate well with the idea of having a base test runner class or library like JUnit, and running within the same scope as your functional test automation, whether it's UI or lower level. But load testing tools, and BlazeMeter is a service that's originally based on JMeter. I think it has additional capabilities as well, beyond just using JMeter. And a tool like Locust, which is a Python equivalent for writing load testing and stress testing services. Locust works more like your traditional code-driven tests than a tool that might have a user interface and its own execution model like JMeter or LoadRunner. And then we've got at the bottom, we've got this little logo of Lighthouse. Now, Google Lighthouse is probably, in terms of web performance testing, one of the most popular tools. And what it's doing is it's testing how your page loads, how the components on your page loads, times like moment to first interactivity, moment to first element or first code sent from the server, from rendering or complete load, right? There's all these stats that Lighthouse gives you. The idea is a performance test is measuring how your app performs regularly, not necessarily under a load, but to measure how long it takes to perform some task, whether it's to load a page or to update the database or some circuit of steps like that. A performance tool helps you keep a baseline and measure that baseline to see that you're not losing performance as you add features. A little bit different in perspective than a load test. Load test tools also give you these performance metrics, but they're also designed to measure it not only under the normal use case, low load, but under high loads, and to stress the system and see what happens when you exceed your load. Can you fail gracefully? Can does your system melt down? Do you start getting 404s or 500 errors? Those sorts of things. And then there's other tools that go beyond load and performance that might be part of your framework. I don't think I have them in here. Yeah, non-functional test requirements like accessibility or security, or user acceptance, right? That there are tools for doing those things. Like Axe is a great accessibility testing tool. OWASP is an open source scanning tool looking for security vulnerabilities and potential things like memory leaks or buffer overflows in source code, which can still happen in type safe languages or whatnot, like Java, Python, or whatever. But on to the next topic, reporting tools, right? Your tool, Cucumber or Cypress or your framework like Serenity may have built-in reporting, but there are specific tools that you can plug in for reporting. Report Portal itself is a cloud service that you can upload that makes it easy to upload your test results and analyze them there. But then there are open source / commercial services like Allure reports and Extent reports that you can plug into your system. TestNG has some reporting service, as well as a bunch of tools built on top of that. And a common standard is actually the old JUnit XML report, which can be parsed and prettified and analyzed in all sorts of ways. For instance, the Jenkins continuous integration server by default understands JUnit XML reports and can display your tests pass failure based on that. Test management tools. How do we track our tests so we know what we're testing? How do we associate our tests to our requirements? How do we determine our coverage? Jira is an old tool that started as a bug tracking tool and has grown beyond measure to include many test management plugins. One of the most popular is Zephyr, one that I've used and can't say I love. And then there's other ones like X-Ray and many others that might be operated as a Jira plugin or externally. I believe there's a Zephyr. I don't know the Zephyr version that is separate from Jira. And then there's standalone tools like TestRail, older tools like Tarantula, or you might use some simple project management tool like I can't think back to the day. Pivotal Tracker is one that I used way back, but kids these days don't need to remember or have me talk about tools I used 20 years ago. And then there's the venerable, which I actually think is still one of the best tools. I did not love my time working with the Mercury tool, which was HP and now Micro Focus, the QTP, which UFT QTP, I don't know. But Quality Center, which is also called ALM or ALM Quality Center now, another Mercury tool, which is good for tracking requirements to tests. Its ability to run tests was geared towards working with Quick Test Pro. Back in the day, I wrote an integration, a simple integration to update test results from Selenium tests, for example, from any tool you could use. Actually, it was written as a library that would map your own open source code-based test automation to test cases and requirements in Quality Center, which made my life easier because Quality Center is a great tool for reporting and tracking. They've got some good graphs. But the user interface for updating tests or for executing tests that are not based on their suite of tools was pretty painful. Anyway, that's a bit of divergence that we didn't need to go into. And then we've got cloud platforms that can be considered a test platform or a test framework for executing, whether it's Selenium or Cypress or other automation. I worked at Sauce Labs for several years, and one of the things I would do was help companies to integrate their existing test framework with Sauce Labs, which oftentimes required extensive rewriting or rebuilding. And Paul or someone else may have known me from when I was doing presentations or working with their company as a solution architect at Sauce Lab. Other great tools that do many of the same functions browser stack, Lambda test, Applet tools, Perfecto, Headspin. There are many tools. They're great. What they really allow you to do is, number one, offload the ability to run your UI automation like Selenium against browsers and mobile devices in their cloud service. So now you don't have to have your framework know how to spin up Selenium servers, associate browsers, and keep different versions of Chrome and Firefox and Edge and Internet Explorer and Safari and whatever else you need. Add mobile devices, clean mobile devices, and maintain versions of Selenium, Chrome Driver, Appium, whatever other libraries you need. And they, in general, have some decent reporting tools, things like screen capture, video playback, Selenium steps. And one of the newer features of these tools are allowing you to upload your test automation and execute it directly on their platforms, which gives a performance benefit. Makes debugging a little easier, but there are trade-offs in everything. All right, CI/CD, continuous delivery. This is my my hobby horse, my I don't know, my bugbear, whatever. This is, I consider, the most important piece of the puzzle in building a test framework or a test automation platform, right? That is that you want your test to execute all the time, or at least whenever it matters, whenever there's a change that you need to test. You want it to be able to execute on a schedule, maybe nightly. A nightly test run is example. You want to execute on a deploy whenever something changes on your test environment, your QA environment, your production environment, etc. And you want to be able to do it as you're developing. So that I'm developing a feature, I want to execute continuous integration, including test automation, as those things are being developed. So a developer can check in code and know within a few minutes whether they broke something. The best reason to do this from a tester's perspective is you can't say, or you don't have to hear a developer say, it worked on my machine, which is something I've heard hundreds of times throughout my career. Or it works for me, or it worked in dev. It works fine in prod, but why can't I test it? Those sorts of things. These tools, again, just to list them off, Jenkins, Travis CI, really pioneered running continuous integration and tests from your repo with your travis.yml file. New tools like GitLab, Circle CI, and GitHub Actions follow the Travis CI example of having a configuration file in your source code repository so that on commit, on pull request, on merging branches, you can trigger test runs, and your source repository becomes your source of truth for your continuous delivery platform as well. Microsoft platform, again, not my expertise, but it's called Azure DevOps. Team City is another one, and then Atlassian Bamboo is another option. There are many other tools in continuous integration. I don't mean to leave some out. These are just ones that I know and wanted to include on the list because they're probably most popular. So we've talked about a lot of different tools, but what's in a test framework? And I've alluded not just what a test framework is, but that it's not just one tool. It's the way that these tools work together. It's the process of developing your automation, and it's the architecture of how you write and maintain your tests. And then lastly, how you execute them. That's why I make CI an important thing. Do you execute your tests locally? Can you execute your tests remotely? Can you execute it cross-platform in parallel? Can you execute a subset of your tests? I'm jumping ahead. So what's in a test framework? Sorry for bullet point driven presentations, but I figure while I'm talking, it'll at least give you something to look at, especially if you've decided to tune me out and you're listening to music or something else. You can get the gist from the bullet points. So the tools, like all these tools we've talked to, are part of your test framework. the libraries you're using, say Selenium. It could also include a logging library, like Log4j. Don't use Log4j. Use a couple years ago there was a security vulnerability in Log4j. That's why I just said that. Right. Other libraries that you may use, including things like Rest Assured for API testing, could be part of your test framework. And again, the difference between a tool or a library or a framework may be ambiguous, and you can argue semantics about that. Another thing that is part of your test framework, and since I like to call myself a test architect, I think test architecture, how you structure your test automation, and the practices and patterns for developing that. That's what I consider test architecture. That's part of your framework. That's part of how you write, execute, maintain, and analyze your tests. Your automation code, I'm going to quibble here, is that the automation code that you write that is reusable between tests can be considered part of your test framework. This may include setup and validation steps. This may include things like page objects. Again, I talked about patterns as part of your test architecture. This may include utilities that query a database or whatever. Right? These are things that may be part of a test framework. Jumping ahead, what's not in the framework is your tests. So that's what I'm getting at, is your automation code should be part of your test framework when it is reusable components, not when it's part of your tests. And ideally, it should be less and less part of your tests. We'll talk about that a bit more. The standards you use, and I don't mean like four-space indentation, mostly because you should always use tabs and you should always use Vim. No, I'm just, right, the standards, the practices, the patterns you follow, and that may consist in the form of documentation. It may consist in the form of static analysis, and it may be just general practices that you teach and enforce through code reviews. Could be part of this framework, right? That's the how you write and maintain your tests. That's part of what, for the sake of this talk, I'm calling a test, part of your test framework. The development process, how you write code, how you check in code, how different people collaborate on test automation, how developers interact with test automation. Are they writing unit tests? Are they collaborating with testers on writing integration tests, etc.? Reporting tools, the ability to analyze your tests over time and come up with a strategy to see how effective your tests are, how fast or slow they are, whether you have areas in your testing that are more or less stable, or whether you have areas in your application that are more or less prone to having bugs introduced, or just that are difficult to automate, right? One of the banes of test automation is false positives or false failures, areas where, in short, your test is to blame. Your test is wrong about whether or not the system is working correctly. This could be because of a mistake in the automation. It could be because of a change in your functionality. It could be because the way you're automating something or the way your environment's set up introduces flakiness in your tests. How you can analyze that is an important part of what your test framework can or cannot do. And it's often, hopefully we'll get to talking more about evaluating. We've only got 5 minutes, so I'm going to jump ahead. How you can maintain tests, how you can reuse code, I talked about that already, and the feedback cycle, which I think continuous integration is an important part of that. I'm just rushing through this because I do want to talk about building and evaluating a test framework. Is that I have 20 minutes left? I thought I had like 5 minutes and then it was Q&A time and then a break. All right, I'll just keep talking and you tell me when to shut up, okay? All right, so what's not in a test framework? Specifically, the whole idea of having a test framework is the presupposition that there's something different than your tests, whether it's utility code, whether it's structure, whether it's how they're executed, whether it's the libraries and how you pull in those dependencies. Those are the things that are in the test framework. The tests themselves, ideally, have a pretty good separation of concern between the framework and the test, so that your test, without too much effort, can be ported to a new framework. Or, for instance, you might be able to plug and play Selenium versus Playwright. Or you might be able to swap out JUnit for TestNG. Or you might be able to change your continuous integration from Jenkins to Circle CI. Or whatever. Swap out reporting tools. Change how you log results. Change how you structure your API code. Whatever it is. Right? You want to be able to separate those things. Your business requirements or your features and scenarios, if you're thinking from a Cucumber's perspective, these type of things are not part of your test framework. They might be something that your test framework needs to interact with, but they shouldn't be part of your tests. They shouldn't be part of your test framework. They should be separate. How you accomplish that depends on your strategy, your philosophy, and frankly, your test framework, what it does. Test environments. Often organizations talk about their dev environment or their QA environment or their staging or production environment. Being able to spin up those environments, being able to interact with those environments, being able to know the configuration, a base URL or a database password. Those things are not part of the framework. The framework may need to know how to interact with them, though, through things like configuration and secrets, things like a .env or your GitHub secrets or whatever it is where you're getting that information. Test data like dummy data for executing tests. I need to have 1,000 random users in order to test this feature, or I need to create a user in order to test something. Ideally, your test should be atomic and be able to get or retrieve or create the test data they need, but that's not always the case. Being able to generate test data might be part of that reusable code in your test framework, but it's a gray area. The development tools you use, and this is a preference. I don't love integrated tools like Catalan Studio or Quick Test Pro or Tricentis Tosca personally. Some people do this, but I like to write my tests as a developer. And so having my development tools not baked into my test framework or my test platform is a nice thing for me. I want to be able to pick my programming language. I want to be able to pick my IDE. I want to be able to pick all my different development tools. And like I say, this can more or less, depending on your needs and your preferences. But from my philosophy, not in the test framework. The collaboration process. Your framework or your software should not dictate your process. For those who use tools like Jira or Salesforce, these tools tend to dictate to a large extent based on the capabilities of the tool or what's easiest to accomplish using the tool's user interface, dictate business processes instead of the other way around. The processes for writing tests, the processes for validation and deployment, if they are not tied to your tests or your test framework, that allows you to swap out your test framework, to modify your test framework in place. And more importantly, it doesn't dictate how you're going to write your tests, how you're going to validate things. So separating that collaboration process from how you write the test is important. Again, your development workflow, things like how you check in code, how you trigger a test run, all sorts of these things should not be a part of the framework if your goal is to have choice and flexibility. If your goal is to standardize on a specific process and workflow, maybe it could live in your framework. And I'm quibbling here, and I should be more assertive about my way is the right way, and blah, blah, blah. All right. Likewise, project management, infrastructure, things like spinning up environments or interacting with your databases shouldn't necessarily live in your test framework, although your test framework may need to know how to work within those constraints. All right, so what do you need in a test framework? I'm going to blow through this list and stress a few things. Here's some examples, right? You need to answer this question for yourself, but these are the type of things I think about when I'm building or evaluating a test framework. I want my tests to execute fast, and I want to get feedback right away from them. I want my tests to be reliable, not flaky, and I want those reliable test results to be repeatable. I don't want to rerun my tests 3 times before I'm confident that I got a result because of environment issues or slow rendering or whatever else. Fast execution in favor of repeatable, reliable execution. Well, that actually ends up being slower if you have to execute something 3 times to get a 50% performance improvement in your tests. Got to think about that. I want my tests to be easy to write and maintain. I want to be able to build up automation that's reusable. I want my reporting to be clear. I've been in many situations, and don't laugh, Stephanie, where the tester has to look through the test report to tell the manager what it means. That's a failure of reporting. And if a report is not allowing you to understand what's happening or to make actionable decisions, well, that's something we need to consider as well. And when I talk about reporting and analytics, I usually think of reporting as what happened, and analytics is what can I learn from what happened over time. So looking at multiple test reports. Test case management and requirements coverage, that ties in closely with the reporting and analytics. What percentage of requirements am I covering, or what percentage of features are being tested? Things like that. How can I collaborate with developers, with manual testers, with product owners, with operations, DevOps, SRE, those sorts of things. The ability for testing and test automation to work together instead of work in its own silo is important, both in terms of getting value from the test automation, but also this is a cardinal point of philosophy that I have, is that the purpose of test automation is to automate the work that these other people are doing to make their lives easier. If we're spending more time maintaining or interpreting or tracking down false positives in our test automation, then that's not giving us value. Or if the reporting from our test automation is opaque or too detailed, then that's another issue. All right, 3 minutes, Paul. Thanks for the warning. We've talked about all these different things, and you can probably read them if you're not listening directly. To make decisions on what we need to do, here's just a bunch of things that when we're developing a test automation framework, what does it need to do? Again, I'll give you a minute to look through this. The idea is, well, we need to write our tests. We need to keep them in version control. We need to get reuse out of our code because automation takes time. If we have to write every test scenario or automate every test scenario from scratch, then the cost of it is too high. We need to be able to execute tests, determine what subset of tests need executed, trigger them when, again, manually or through CI. Keep track of those results and analyze those over time. I kind of covered all this. Generate and retrieve test data, etc. And here's an important thing. We need to be able to debug and fix broken tests. Now, we talked about what we I have, I think one of these is this is supposed to say, I think, what do you need to know? So this do on this slide should be, is my software working properly? That's something I need to know. Which tests did I execute? Which requirements are covered? Again, this is my reporting, analytics, and coverage. What systems were tested on which environments? What versions of the code were tested along that? How long it takes to execute? What caused the false failures? How long does it take me to figure out what that was? And what did my automation exist? What issues escaped? These are questions I want my test framework to answer. I'm out of time pretty much, but to build a test framework, I wanted to talk about primarily following that feedback cycle that you can get from continuous integration. Don't go spending months building or assembling a test framework from components. Start small. Follow good test automation principles. I think I've got a slide on that coming up. Things like keep it simple, don't repeat yourself, separation of concerns, all those things. And have a continuous feedback loop. Start small, add features, add reporting, add logging as you go. Think of scalability from the start. And just like all tests, keep it green. Keep your test framework stable and refactor as you go. Here's all the test automation principles I just covered. Things that you need to decide when you're building a test framework, and then evaluating a test framework. Here are the questions you might want to ask. What are your goals? Again, these aren't always the same for everyone. What experience do you have? Do you want to use a GUI tool that's a record and playback tool versus code? Depends on the skill set or inclinations of your testers. What do you want to learn and what do you want to improve when you evaluate a test framework? And I really feel like I've missed out on the punch because I wanted to talk about how we build and evaluate a framework, but I talked too much. And just lastly, measuring success. We want to define the criteria, and those are going to be different, or at least slightly different for everyone. You want to rank by importance. It's really important to us that we can fix failures in tests quickly, or that we can modify our tests quickly because we have a rapidly changing UI. I want to know what my failure rates are. Why are my tests failing? How fast they execute? What are the goals? Can we accurately identify issues? Can new team members write new tests and get up to speed quickly? Those sorts of things. Anyway, I love working on test frameworks. I love evaluating or building test frameworks, and I hope you got something useful out of this and ready for Q&A.
This is fantastic. Aaron, one of the things I wanted to say is you actually compartmentalized a lot of this into different areas. There is there's so many different aspects of automation, and you've actually put it together in good groups. I recommend to everybody to who was looking at this, that this actually shows good stuff. I like that last metric slide that you had up there. That's one of the things that I tell everyone is that there's going to be managers who think a good metric is how many test cases have you automated, and when are we going to get to 100%? And have you, Aaron, have you been in that situation where they ask you one of those two questions, and how do you deal with that?
I have. I like to approach things and say there are different ways of analyzing it, and maybe it's me being politic, but the way I like to work is I consider this, and so I say, here's my philosophy. If it matches what you need, then great. If not, it doesn't. But my philosophy in terms of that is number of tests is not your best metric. It does tell you how many tests you have, but fewer tests can be better for several reasons. Number one, they can execute quicker. Number two, there's less of a burden of maintenance. And number three, um, one problem with having a lot of tests is if you have a few failures and you have a lot of tests, then you might say, well, we've got a 99 or a 97% pass rate. It looks pretty good. Well, if 80% of your tests are trivial and never fail, and you have a 97% pass rate, well, you actually have, what is that? Say it's 80 to 97. So that'd be is that a 15% actual important test failure?
Mm,
So that kind of disguises it, and that's another thing to consider.
that's good. I usually tell people that they're always adding more features and functionalities and requirements, so I can never really get much beyond 80% because there's always more being added on that. I try and avoid the 100% thing. I do want to get over to one other question over here. Artem Golbev asked, what about plain English based frameworks? That's kind of the whole new area where we got low code, no code automation tools. Aaron, what's your opinion on that area of automation tools?
So you can think of tools like Cucumber or Fitness before it that were kind of plain English, or you can think of Robot Framework from a non-BDD perspective of writing plain English-based framework. My answer to that is kind of to judo and say, and that was what I was kind of stressing at the beginning, is that might be an aspect of your test framework, and it may drive how your test framework looks, right? We're going to use Cucumber, or we're going to use Mabel or something like that. But my answer is that's an aspect of your framework. It's not really your framework.
Okay.
Important parts of your framework are execution and coverage and things like that that aren't specific to plain English based tests.
That's good. I actually know Artem actually is very closely related to a tool out there called Test Rigger. We've had him on the show before, talked a little bit about it, and it's basically it kind of puts you guys like you and me a little bit out of business because it's plain English. You could just say click the add to cart button and it goes and finds that button and goes and clicks on it. But there's a lot of stuff behind the scenes to make that magic happen.
Yeah, and from my opinion, that's an aspect. No, reducing the amount of code you need to write for clicking a button, great. And then you have a question of what's the trade-off for that. And then to me, automating something is a small part of the automation framework.
Yeah, I agree.
Maybe not a small part, but it's only part of that framework by the definition I'm using here, which may not be your definition, and that's okay.
That's okay. Let's see. We got like 3 minutes. Let me see if there's one other question I could see in our list over here. I know someone was actually asking, what is Postman? I think it was actually kind of answered in the list there, but give another overview of what Postman is and what it does for us.
Sure. If we had 5 minutes, I'd just bring it up and make an API call. But Postman is a graphical tool. It started off as actually a Chrome browser plugin. You enter a URL for your web service, right? Your API, and you can specify parameters like your headers, your query string parameters, your authentication, or I mean your authorization, your HTTP method, get, post, put, delete. And Postman is just a tool that allows you to write, structure, and execute those API tests. It's a really great tool. I love it for ad hoc API testing or exploring APIs as I'm writing automation. But my own preference is to then push my automation into a coding based framework that'll run, whether it's Java, JUnit, or Python, PyTest. And there are some rudimentary tools that allow you to export from Postman to that. But there are also ways you can write things in Postman, structure variables, and set up steps, and some limited reporting with Postman itself, and execute your tests there.
That's a great explanation. Last thing, Aaron, if people want to get a hold of you and any information, is there anything you can share with us? Any Is there any websites you've got, or videos, or any way that we could know more about what you do?
Well, just harking back to the beginning. There's my email on the first slide. I'm not much on social media anymore. Like I don't have Twitter or whatever. You can probably search for me on LinkedIn. I still keep that going, kind of. And I have in the past and hope to in the future post more content to my YouTube channel. Oneshore.com is my website, but it's a broken website at this point.
Oh no,
Uh,
it needs testing.
It needs development, but I never have time.
Right.
I guess, and I have a blog again which has been neglected. Harking back to the days when I quit testing and went to Fiji. It's called FijiAaron.com.
Great.
It started as here's pictures for my family to see, and now it's kind of my testing blog.
Cool. Aaron, I want to thank you very much for joining us here at Apple Tech on these test talks. I hope to have you back sometime in the future. It's been a real blast. I agree with everything that you got on your list of slides out there. This has been really a good educational thing, and I again thank you for joining us today.
All right. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everyone.